Hey guys and girls, on this video I will be discussing the fourth episode of the first season of the X-Files, and the episode is called Conduit. So this week's X-Files review, and just a warning, I will be going into quite a few spoilers from the beginning, so if you've never seen the episode, just putting that out there. So this returns to a UFO style plot, a bit like the first two episodes of the series. The difference this time is that it does actually connect to Mulder's past. It refers back to obviously what happened to his sister when he was a young boy. He previously opened up to Scully about that in the pilot, I think it was, about the fact that she went missing mysteriously, and obviously it was unsolved. There was never, a body wasn't found, or she never returned home, but he always believed that she was abducted by UFOs. And that's, of course, one of the big factors between his belief in finding out the truth and his passion for the X-Files. So this this plot connects to that because it's a similar sort of an incident where we have this family. It opens with them, they're in a caravan. You have Kerry Snodgrass who guest stars as the mother, quite a well-known character actress. And at the beginning, she gets trapped inside the caravan, and she hears noises from the outside. She can hear her daughter Ruby and her son Kevin screaming, and she's trapped inside, so she can't do anything. So it's kind of suggested then the door is being jammed shut by something mysterious, and she hears all sorts of noises. She burns her hand on the handle as she tries to open it, and when she opens it again, her son's there and he's panicking, but the daughter Ruby has vanished mysteriously. So Mulder wants to pursue this, even though there's very little evidence then this is actually worthy of being an X-Files. And that's when it's hinted at or brought up by the director of the FBI, or Scully's director anyway, that Mulder probably might be getting a bit too personally involved in the case, because of the fact that it is a teenage girl, as his sister Samantha was, and just the mysterious nature. So he wants to pursue it as an X-Files, even though on the face of it, it's just a regular disappearance. And we get one of these situations where Scully is sort of an in-between again, where even though she might not necessarily believe that this is an X-Files or that there's anything supernatural going on, she does persuade the powers that be to let her pursue it. She says, well, at least let me make a recommendation. So she's always, or at least this point in the show, she's very much an in-between sort of person who kind of can see things both ways and is very neutral, as in she just wants to get the truth, and she'll point out little things, even though, because she does go for back to Mulder, the director says, do you think his personal history is clouding his judging this? And she and no, but she kind of does concede that it maybe is a bit shaky, and there's not a lot to go on, but she does persuade them, as I said, to make a recommendation to Mulder, or at least as far as the case goes. And obviously she discusses Mulder it with Mulder, and it's almost like she's kind of monitoring him and is quite cautious, quite conscious throughout the episode. Is he taking this too personally? But they obviously go to this town. There's actually a funny little line in when they're having the conversation in the office beforehand, because she kind of like one of them, I think, is Scully, mentions like this like just this random case about like a lizard mother or something. Like she's like, well, how is this any different than that? And he points out, well, because the lizard mother didn't live in such and such place. And that's when we find out what the connection is, what makes Mulder convinced that this is an X-File. And the reason is because the mother herself, Darlene, was involved in a similar incident back when she was a girl. So she claims a similar thing happened to her as happened to her daughter now, and that she was abducted by a UFO, or at least had that sort of experience. I couldn't quite figure out actually if she was saying she'd been abducted or if she just witnessed something like that. And also it just happened to be in the same place, the same location, so it's sort of like somewhere like a caravan type, holiday type location. And it's when she was in the Girl Scouts. So that certainly makes Mulder think there might be something here, the fact that it's happened to the same woman. So they go to investigate in this town in Ira, and there's all sorts of like suspicion from the local authorities, who are kind of, well, not suspicion, but they're very cynical about the whole case. They're quite sort of down on the family in general. At one point, the sheriff like makes reference to the fact that the daughter was always getting into trouble, and there's no evidence, and he kind of just thinks Darlene is just making up stories just to maybe make herself feel better or something. Quite sort of demeaning, and at the same time you get this sort of sub going on with the brother Kevin, who's been obviously quite traumatized by the whole experience. And when Mulder and Scully go to interview like Darlene and then talks to Kevin, Mulder notices he's got like these random like series of numbers and symbols that kind of look like the sort of UFO style coordinates that we used to see. And obviously this sort of like rings alarm bells. Well, why does this kid have these like random things, and what are they? And it's later said to Mulder then it is like official sort of government document sort of thing, or a copy of, and that obviously sends him racing even more. But that's the setup. I don't think this one really hits me that hard. I guess I'd say it's a mediocre episode. Now, I do like the Mulder stuff, like his backstory with his sister. I do like it as a motivation for his passion for the X-Files, his search for the truth and all that. And it makes sense to have this sort of an episode this early into the season. It just does addresses that, and I think it sort of builds on the Mulder and Scully relationship as well, because she's very much concerned about him. Is he getting too personal involved? All that. You see her at various points kind of saying you are maybe getting too attached to this, and kind of just being there for him emotionally. I think the problem is it just doesn't really hit you that emotionally. I think there is something about the episode that feels a bit too dry, a bit too kind of on the nose. There's some like visual like moments and metaphors that just feel a little bit clunky. I think there's some dialogue that feels a bit on the cheesy side. It just doesn't have a great deal of like mood or atmosphere. And I think they don't do that much with the whole idea. As I said, it is an interesting thing, the backstory with him and his sister, but this isn't like the best episode to explore that, I don't think. There's an episode in season 4, Paper Hearts, where it becomes relevant. And I won't say much about that because, hey, I'll get to that when I get to that. But it's a really good episode, actually. It's a really disturbing episode, but that does a much better job of addressing the whole like past with his sister. This doesn't really do it. As I said, the drama does feel a bit flat in it. It never really grabbed me emotionally. I think another problem is it just feels like a bit of a grab bag of like just stuff, of just cliches that you maybe associate with certain, well, X-Files episodes, but also certain TV and movies. So you have like this spooky looking kid, Kevin, who has like this sort of disturbed sort of nature about him. He's got almost like the Children of the Damned type look, and those like scary eyes, sort of freaked out. But they don't really do a lot with that. The theory is that Mulder thinks he's like the conduit of the title, then because he experienced like his sister's abduction, that he became like a sort of like a receiver of like data information from the UFOs that he now gets from like the TV and stuff. And I think that kind of feels a bit hokey. That feels kind of like B movie and sort of throwaway. But because you don't get that much of like the supporting characters like Kevin and Darlene, because I think the kid playing Kevin is good from what you see of him. But yeah, it does feel a bit of a cliche, the kind of spooky kid. It does happen a lot in the X-Files, and sometimes they do really interesting things with it, and they really go with it, and yeah, it does work out well. I think this is one of the lesser examples. And again, Carrie Snodgrass, really good actress, so she definitely adds something, but she's very much in and out. And I think, again, just some of the beats in this are kind of cliched. So it gets to a certain point where the local authorities like kind of go in and like arrest her and her son because there's this whole thing with him having like these coordinates and this whole kind of suspicion on him. So they sort of manhandle her, and because of this, Darlene doesn't trust Mulder and Scully because she's like, well, I thought you were here to help me and Kevin, and she basically doesn't trust them, and just tells them to stay away from her and her son at one point. And I think just scenes like that, it just feels like in a real sense you can see, well, yeah, you can see that the mother, you can understand where the mother's coming from, and you might well have the same response if you were in this situation. But the trouble is, for the sake of the drama and stuff, it's not very interesting. It doesn't really, it kind of like blocks any potential like interesting drama, and it's just this bit of this stereotype about like the spooky boy who may or may not be linked, the mother who's kind of like resistant, and it's like, stay away from my son. And certain other things like the local authorities, as I said, being like quite demeaning towards like the family and the daughter in particular, Ruby. There's this other thing going on with this girl Tessa who knew Ruby. She like approaches Mulder and Scully in the library, and she has this sort of secret, and when it comes out later, you kind of understand why this scene is so like mysterious. But it does look kind of silly. She's like talking to them through like the kind of like on the other side of like the bookshelf, and just say it's almost like she doesn't want them to know who she is. But she gives them information that apparently Ruby was pregnant with her boyfriend's baby, and that may have had something to do with the disappearance. So she's sort of thrown suspicion on that. And it's like when they said, "Oh, you're a friend of Ruby," she's like, "Ruby didn't have any friends." And it later turns out then Tessa was the one who was pregnant. Actually, she was like, well, with Greg, so I don't know if she was having an affair or if it was really his baby. I suppose it was like an affair, or like not if he wasn't Ruby's boyfriend. But I guess it was just meant to be an affair. But that's sort of a red herring to make you think then it could be Tessa. She could be the one who killed Ruby, because obviously there would be a motivation, which obviously Mulder isn't buying, because there's still not a body and all that sort of thing. And I do actually like in that interrogation scene when they're like interviewing Tessa, when he starts like banging on the table, he's like going hardball into her. It's like, you were the one pregnant, weren't you? You were the one pregnant, and you shot her, right? Bang! And it's like, you killed her, didn't you? Bang, bang. It's pretty good stuff, actually. But yeah, that's obviously just like to kind of throw you off the scent in a way. But there are some kind of cliche and cheesy moments, as I was saying. There's this other sort of thing going on where Mulder and Scully go into like this biker bar, and it's because they're searching for Greg, the boyfriend, who apparently works there, and he's not there. But Mulder talks to like this biker guy, this really rough looking dude, who's another familiar face actually. I think he's another sort of guy you see pop up in a lot, but he has like a UFO tattoo on his arm, and he's got like this mutilated ear, which they see, which is obviously meant to have something to do with like a close encounter. But it does feel kind of similar to like the woman who owned like the calf and who had the UFO pictures in like the second episode in Deep Throat. It does feel quite similar, and it's just another thing thrown in there which doesn't really have that much to do with the actual plot. It's just then obviously they supposedly have experienced UFO activity around the same site as this happened. So you get another brief scene with them where they're kind of like rolling through on their motorbikes. Towards the end, when Mulder and Scully catch up with like Darlene, Kevin, and when Ruby basically gets returned, when she appears again. But at that point, Darlene shuts things down. Even though she is basically saying, yeah, this sort of happened, I experienced it, and now it's happened to my daughter. She actually makes quite a good point at the end, because she says to the agents that, yeah, the truth has caused me nothing but heartache. I'm just going to tell them that, yeah, my daughter spent like the last week or whatever in the back of like a car or something, that she was obviously just, she was taken and then returned. And so it's actually quite an interesting, relatable point she makes there. Then sometimes the truth is just too much, it is just too stressful and just takes too much out of you. And I think in a way we see like a link there between her and Mulder, because he's been living with what happened to his daughter, on, let's say it's Freudian slip, with his sister, and he's carried that weight on his shoulders for all these years and continues to carry it, because you do see certain things hitting him emotionally in the episode. So you totally sympathise with Darlene and what she's going through. So kind of the basis for a good episode is there. It just doesn't really come together. It's just not very well plotted, and as I said, it didn't really grab me like emotionally or atmospherically. It's just a little bit of a bland episode overall, just not too much to it. I thought the end scene, you have Mulder sitting in a church, sort of like mulling things over. And I guess that's kind of interesting as a final shot because he's obviously there in a place of faith and it's all about him believing. Another thing I read into that is then it might also be because Scully is like religious. So maybe in a way it's meant to have some sort of a link to that. Just the fact that it's almost like he's engaging with Scully's world for a minute. It's like he's obviously thinking about his daughter and has this belief, but he's gone to like a religious like venue to sort of kind of have that experience, have that sort of like thought process and stuff. So it could be coincidence that they just went with a church, but I sort of thought about that. But yes, it's a pretty weak episode. It's not terrible, but in my opinion, it probably is the weakest episode so far. Even more so than the pilot, but it's at least still solid. There are some really weak episodes coming up in this season. So it's not down there with those, but it is actually my least favourite so far out of the 4. So when it comes to ratings, I'm going to give it a 5.5 out of 10. So yeah, just a little lower than the pilot. So yeah, I don't need to say it really, but when it comes to like the list, the rankings of all the episodes, it's going to go below the pilot at number 4 on the list. So that's Conduit, my thoughts. If you agree, if you're not such a big fan of this episode, then let me know your thoughts on it. But if you disagree, more interestedly, if you actually do like this episode, then please make your case for it in the comments below. Let me know what you like about it. Let me know what you think of the X-Files up to this point. Especially if you're watching it for a first time, that would be interesting to hear. But fingers crossed, I should be back next week with another review. Obviously, that will be episode 5, and that's the Jersey Devil, which I'm looking forward to rewatching because it's one of those kind of urban myth sort of type episodes, and I think sometimes they can be some of the best. I remember quite enjoying it anyway. It does have some cheesy sort of ideas in it, but it's one I always remember enjoying. It's been a while since I've seen it, but I'm kind of expecting it to be a decent time without maybe being mind-blowing. But that's the next one coming up. That's the Jersey Devil episode 5 if you want to check that out before the review next week. But I'll be back with more X-Files soon. Take care and goodbye.